ORD as soon as possible.
Mr.
Oh, Bruce Wayne.
Val Kilmer didn't want his death to be a spectacle. There were no press conferences, no teary tributes on late-night shows, no grand red carpet memorials with flashing cameras and A-list eulogies. He died on April 1st, 2025, at the age of 65. And at first, the world barely noticed. But inside his quiet departure was a story louder than any headline. It wasn't a story of fame or fortune or forgotten legacy. It was about a man who chose to leave this world the same way he lived his final years. Carefully, quietly, and completely on his own terms. To most, he was Iceman. He was Batman. He was Jim Morrison. He was the guy who could melt a scene with one stare, or outshine co-stars with a single line.
It's been so gratifying. As you know, it's fun to go to work and have people applaud. When you exchange laughter, it feels, I'm gonna start to cry.
But to the people who really mattered, his daughter Mercedes, his son Jack, a few lifelong friends, he was something else entirely. He was the man who edited every home video, who never missed a birthday, and who long before anyone realized he was preparing for the end, had already begun saying goodbye in the most personal way possible. Not with words on a stage, but with videos, with handwritten letters, with photos no one had ever seen. With a will so carefully assembled, it read less like a legal document and more like a private museum of memories. It wasn't until after his passing that the truth emerged. Locked away in his Los Angeles home, sealed inside a hand-delivered envelope from his longtime attorney, were not just instructions on how to divide his estate, but a final gift. For Mercedes, a box filled with 300 unpublished photos, one of them framed, just the two of them, standing in the dust behind a forgotten ranch. For Jack, a handwritten film script and a sealed letter marked only with one line: "For when you're ready to tell your story." Alongside those were hard drives full of self-recorded videos. Clips where Val spoke directly to them, one-on-one, telling the stories he never shared with the world, explaining the silence, the solitude, and what he feared the most, not death, but being misunderstood. What kind of man spends his final decade not chasing sympathy, but crafting a goodbye so intimate it could break the strongest hearts? What kind of father records a farewell for his children, not to be famous, but to be heard one last time?
Sad news that the film star Val Kilmer, who played Batman and Jim Morrison, as well as starring in Top Gun, has died at the age of 65.
This is not the story of a Hollywood downfall. It's not about a superstar fading into obscurity. This is something else. A quiet legacy left behind by a man who had nothing left to prove, but everything left to say. And once his children unlocked what he left for them, they weren't the only ones in tears. The world began to see Val Kilmer not as a character on screen, but as a father, a fighter, and an artist who rewrote what it means to say goodbye. When Val Kilmer passed away, his family didn't walk into a press conference. They walked into a house, his house. The same Los Angeles property that had quietly become his private retreat, his workspace, and his archive. Less than 48 hours after his death, his attorney of almost 20 years arrived at that house carrying a sealed envelope and a USB drive. No camera crews, no announcements, just a simple gathering. His two children, Mercedes and Jack, and a few close confidants. What happened inside that room didn't involve lawyers fighting over assets or tabloids sniffing for scandal. It was something more raw, more personal, and more deliberate. Kilmer had written a will, but not the kind people usually leave behind. It was 27 pages of intimate planning, crafted, curated, and updated just 6 weeks before his death. Most wills distribute wealth. Val's distributed memories. Instead of focusing on material things, he left behind instructions. Emotional, detailed, and deeply human. For his daughter Mercedes, he left a hand-carved wooden box containing over 300 unpublished photographs. Not glossy promo shots, not behind-the-scenes press junk. These were real. From movie sets to quiet family dinners, one of the photos was already framed. Just the two of them, standing behind the barren desert land of a ranch in New Mexico, the same spot where he once wrote an unpublished screenplay titled Salt Sky. That image wasn't just sentimental, it was symbolic. Mercedes would later say it felt like her father had already said goodbye in that photo, long before he ever left. For Jack, Kilmer's son, he left something even more haunting. A handwritten film script labeled, "For Jack, if you're ready to tell your story." Alongside it, a typed letter addressed to Jack's 30-year-old self. It wasn't vague or poetic. It was raw. In it, Kilmer wrote, "If you're reading this, it means I'm gone. But everything you need to understand me is right here, in every word, every silence." That letter wasn't read by Jack alone. The attorney read it aloud in the room, his voice cracking as he went. No one interrupted. No one spoke. It wasn't just a goodbye. It was a passing of the torch, from a father who had nothing left to say publicly, but everything to whisper privately. But Kilmer didn't stop at letters and photos. Inside the drive were self-recorded videos, dozens of them, each one named, time-stamped, titled, and organized into folders by year. Some were personal messages, others were stories, things he never shared with anyone else. Reflections from early in his career, regrets he'd never admitted out loud, words of advice, fragments of memory that might have otherwise vanished with him. He even recorded several videos multiple times, just to say it the right way. This wasn't a man casually leaving behind a goodbye. This was someone building a time capsule, layer by layer, designed not to be watched by the world, but to be experienced by the only people who ever really knew him. And then there was the rest of the will, the kind most people expect. An estate estimated between $10 and $25 million, divided equally between his children. Modest by Hollywood standards, but still meaningful. There were real estate holdings, film royalties, and a modest investment portfolio. But one detail stood out. A portion of the estate was allocated specifically to maintain his 160-acre property in New Mexico. In his own handwriting, Kilmer wrote, "Keep this place if you need peace or want to write a story of your own without telling anyone." It wasn't an instruction, it was permission. And finally, a piece that no one in the room expected. He donated part of his estate to causes he never publicly acknowledged, a fund for throat cancer research, an arts program for underprivileged kids in New Mexico, and support for a local theater class he had anonymously sponsored for years. Only after the will became public did anyone learn that Val Kilmer had quietly kept giving, even as his own body deteriorated. According to the attorney, this wasn't some rushed legal formality. It was a process Kilmer had been working on for years. He rewrote, reorganized, and re-edited his materials obsessively. A close friend later said, "Most people leave behind money. Val left behind unfinished conversations. And in doing so, he did something rare in Hollywood. He gave his family closure not through spectacle, but through story. His story." But this deeply personal farewell didn't appear out of nowhere. It was born out of nearly a decade of quiet pain, silent suffering, and a decision that changed everything: to battle in private, without telling the world. The world didn't realize when Val Kilmer started slipping away. In 2014, people noticed something different. His sudden weight loss, the tired eyes, a noticeable withdrawal from Hollywood events. Rumors began to swirl. Some said he was method acting for a new role. Others whispered about secret surgeries, substance use, or a nervous breakdown. But Kilmer said nothing. He brushed it all off. And for 3 years, he kept the world guessing. He didn't owe the public an explanation, and he made sure they didn't get one. But behind that silence, something far more brutal was happening. Val Kilmer was fighting for his life. By the time he confirmed it publicly in 2017, his illness had already progressed. Throat cancer, aggressive, painful, and relentless. It had already taken his voice, reduced his strength, and forced him through 2 tracheotomy surgeries. His words, once the tool that shaped characters like Doc Holliday and Jim Morrison, were now just fragments, rough, broken. He relied on a feeding tube. He struggled to breathe. And still, he refused to let the world see him as weak. Kilmer didn't want sympathy. He didn't want pity headlines or magazine interviews about resilience. What he wanted was space, and so he vanished. Not entirely, not all at once, but slowly. He retreated to his home in New Mexico, a place so remote and quiet it might as well have existed off the map. There, Surrounded by red soil and silence, he began to do what he'd always done best: create. But this time, the work wasn't for the screen. It wasn't for critics, or agents, or studios. It was for him, and for his children. Most days were spent archiving, sorting old footage, rewatching classic films, painting, journaling. He would sit in front of a camera, not to perform, but to speak to Mercedes and Jack directly. Not in real time, but in preparation for the day he wouldn't be able to speak at all. The voice that once carried monologues now existed only in the past, and Kilmer knew that. That's why he took control of it before it disappeared entirely. He started cataloging his thoughts. He recorded messages, readings, even inner monologues. He wasn't just facing mortality, he was preserving himself for the people who mattered. In 2020, he finally opened the curtain, just a little, with the release of his memoir, I'm Your Huckleberry. For the first time, he described in detail what it felt like to lose control of his body. He wrote about isolation, identity, and the psychology of illness. But even then, he didn't seek emotional applause. The tone of the book was detached, deliberate. He wasn't asking to be seen as a survivor. He was trying to explain what had happened, in his own voice, before that voice was gone. Forever. That book was the closest thing the public ever got to understanding what Kilmer had endured. But even that was just the surface. His friends later revealed he had filmed hours of unreleased material during this time, some of it addressed to no one in particular. Just raw footage of him reflecting, alone in his study, his voice barely audible. Some of these clips were found on the encrypted drives left for his kids. And in them, he talks about everything: art, fear, legacy, love, and loss. Not as a celebrity, not as a star, just as a man trying to come to terms with disappearing. What makes this chapter of his life so remarkable isn't just the suffering. It's the way he chose to carry it, quietly, privately, and with complete control. In an industry built on exposure, Val Kilmer chose invisibility. Not because he had nothing left to give, but because he wanted to give it to the right people, in the right way, when it mattered most. But just when it seemed like Kilmer had left Hollywood behind forever, something happened that no one saw coming. A surprise return in one of the most emotional scenes of his career. For nearly a decade, Val Kilmer had disappeared from the spotlight. No premieres, no interviews, no late-night appearances. Hollywood had quietly moved on. At least that's what everyone thought. But in 2022, something unexpected happened. A whisper turned into a headline. A rumor turned into reality. Val Kilmer was coming back. Not for a press tour, not for a documentary, but for one final role. A single, brief, carefully planned moment that would shake the hearts of moviegoers across the world. Top Gun: Maverick. When word leaked that Tom Cruise wanted Kilmer back for the sequel, most people assumed it was a nostalgic gimmick, a small cameo, maybe a flashback. After all, Kilmer couldn't even speak properly anymore. How could he possibly return to the big screen? But what fans didn't know was that this wasn't just a marketing move. It was personal. Behind the scenes, Cruise had visited Kilmer at his home multiple times. Not as a co-star, but as a friend. Someone who had seen the transformation Kilmer had gone through and wanted to give him one last moment to stand in front of the camera. Not as a shell of his former self, but as Iceman, the man who had once stolen every scene he touched. The scene they filmed together wasn't long. It lasted only a few minutes, but it hit like a gut punch. Iceman, now an admiral, unable to speak, sitting in silence across from Maverick. And then, he does speak. A single line. A voice that wasn't his, not entirely. Kilmer's real voice was gone. So the filmmakers used cutting-edge AI, pulling from hours of past recordings, interviews, films, voiceovers, to recreate it. It wasn't fake. It was forensic. It was built from the real thing, reconstructed by engineers and approved by Kilmer himself. And when he spoke in that scene, audiences didn't just hear Iceman. They heard Val. A man who had fought to be understood one last time. Everyone on set knew the gravity of what they were witnessing. The director, Joseph Kosinski, later said no one left the set without a lump in their throat. This wasn't just a reunion between two characters. It was two men, two legends. facing time, illness, and mortality in real life. Through fiction, Kilmer didn't cry. He didn't need to. His silence said more than any monologue ever could. And Tom Cruise? He didn't say much about the moment publicly. But after Kilmer's passing, he released one private sentence that said everything. Without Val, there would be no Iceman, and no me as I am today. It was Kilmer's final performance. After that, he didn't take another role. He didn't need to. That one scene closed the curtain not just on a character, but on an entire era. It gave fans closure, yes, but more importantly, it gave Kilmer the ending he wanted. Controlled, purposeful, quiet. What made it even more powerful was that so few people knew what it took to make that moment happen. The physical toll, the emotional preparation, the technology used to bring his voice back, even for just one scene. Kilmer had nothing to gain from it. He didn't do it for awards, or legacy, or money. He did it because it mattered to him. Because Top Gun was more than a franchise. It was a turning point in his life. And now, it was also his final chapter on screen. To audiences, it was a beautiful reunion. To Kilmer, it was a message, I'm still here. I never left. And when the screen faded to black, it didn't feel like an ending. It felt like a salute. Not from Iceman to Maverick, but from Val to everyone watching. Those who cheered for him, misunderstood him, forgot him, and finally remembered what made him unforgettable. But even with that powerful farewell on screen, Kilmer's greatest work wasn't filmed, it was lived. And what the world didn't see was the life he built in solitude, far away from Hollywood's lights. Long before the illness, before the retreat into silence, and even before Top Gun, Val Kilmer wasn't like other Hollywood stars. He didn't chase magazine covers, he didn't network at parties, and he rarely played the Hollywood game. From the beginning, he operated on his own frequency. Brilliant, stubborn, intensely focused. To some directors, he was a dream. To others, he was a nightmare. But no one ever called him ordinary. Kilmer wasn't interested in fame for fame's sake. He craved meaning. He turned down blockbuster roles most actors would kill for. Not because he was arrogant, but because they didn't move him. In a town obsessed with yes, Kilmer made a career out of saying no. If the character didn't challenge him, if the script felt hollow, he walked away. It didn't matter how big the studio was or how much money they offered. That refusal to compromise became both his power and his curse. After rocketing to stardom in the 80s with cult classics like Top Secret and Real Genius, he exploded into global fame as Iceman in Top Gun. But instead of riding that wave into a string of action franchises, Kilmer went the opposite direction. He chose roles that were layered, risky, and often controversial. In 1991, he disappeared into the role of Jim Morrison in The Doors, giving a performance so uncanny that even the surviving band members said they couldn't tell where Morrison ended and Kilmer began. 2 years later, he stunned again as Doc Holliday in Tombstone, a role that became iconic, not because it was flashy, but because it was haunted. And then came Batman Forever, a role most actors would dream of. But for Kilmer, wearing the cape wasn't liberating. It was suffocating. The suit was physically restrictive. The production was controlled by merchandising deals, and the creative process, something he valued above all, was absent. Years later, Kilmer admitted that playing Batman wasn't creatively satisfying. He didn't return for the sequel. He didn't have to. He had made his point. By the late 90s, Kilmer had earned a reputation, not for scandals or meltdowns or outrageous behavior, but for being difficult. Directors whispered that he was too intense. Studios feared he would derail schedules. But those who worked with him long-term saw it differently. They said he was a perfectionist, that he was laser-focused, that he cared so deeply about the work, he refused to fake anything, even politeness. That kind of purity is rare in the industry, and it comes with a cost. Eventually, the system stopped calling. But Kilmer didn't flinch. He simply moved. In 2002, he left Los Angeles behind and bought a 6,000-acre ranch in New Mexico. To outsiders, it looked like he was vanishing. But to Kilmer, it was a beginning, a return to something real. There, surrounded by silence and space, He wrote screenplays, painted, took photographs, and hosted small creative gatherings with close friends. The man who once stood at the center of Hollywood was now building a world with no cameras, no agents, and no expectations. He once said he didn't leave Hollywood. He just moved to a place where he didn't have to pretend anymore. That single sentence reveals everything about who Kilmer truly was. He wasn't anti-Hollywood. He was pro-truth. He didn't resent success. He resented shallowness. And that core belief, living by your own values, no matter the cost, followed him to the very end. And yet, beneath the brilliant actor and the complex artist was something even more powerful. Val Kilmer, the father. The quiet presence, the private guide, the man who gave his children everything the spotlight never could. To the world, Val Kilmer was a movie star. To Mercedes and Jack, he was the guy who cooked strange meals in the middle of the night, who paused old movies to point out camera angles, who labeled every home video by year, and hand-wrote notes on the back of every photo. He was their dad, and the man they knew off-screen was almost unrecognizable compared to the roles he played. He wasn't Batman, he wasn't Iceman, he wasn't a mythic Hollywood figure. He was just Dad, messy, curious, quiet, and endlessly devoted. In 1988, Kilmer married actress Joanne Whalley after meeting on the set of Willow. Their marriage lasted 8 years. It ended in 1996, but their bond didn't dissolve. Together, they raised Mercedes, born in 1991, and Jack, born in 1995. After the divorce, Whalley moved to the UK, while Kilmer remained in the US, often at his ranch in New Mexico. But the physical distance never turned into emotional distance. He made it a point to stay connected, never letting his career, or later, his illness, get in the way of fatherhood. Unlike many celebrity parents, Kilmer avoided parading his children in front of the media. He never brought them to premieres or used his last name to boost their careers. There were no red carpet appearances or carefully curated magazine spreads. He kept their lives private, intentionally. When Mercedes and Jack eventually chose to enter the entertainment industry, it was on their own terms. Jack's breakout came in Palo Alto in 2013, a film he landed on merit, not legacy. Mercedes, more selective, pursued acting but rarely talked about her father's career, unless asked directly. And when she did, her words always circled back to the same idea: respect, not pressure. He didn't teach them how to act. He taught them how to think, how to be honest, how to treat creativity as a sacred responsibility. Mercedes once said, "He never gave advice like he knew better. He only responded when we asked. And even then, he made sure we knew that art wasn't about applause. It was about saying what you really mean." Kilmer never cared if they became famous. He cared that they stayed true to themselves, just like he had, even when it cost him. Their most vivid memories of him weren't tied to movies or fame. They were quieter, more personal. Jack recalls long nights in New Mexico, curled up on an old couch watching black and white films. They didn't just watch, they studied. Every shot, every performance, every frame was a lesson. Jack says his father taught him how to see cinema not as entertainment, but as conversation. And when Kilmer lost his ability to speak, that conversation didn't end. It just changed mediums. He taught Jack to read the eyes, the silences, the stillness between words. During his final years, Kilmer rarely left the house. His illness had stripped him of much physically, but never mentally. Even when he could no longer talk freely, he stayed present. He organized his archive obsessively, labeling videos, curating photos, recording messages. Mercedes once admitted the hardest part wasn't hearing the diagnosis. It was hearing nothing at all. The silence, the absence of her father's voice. For a man who had once made a living speaking other people's words, losing his own felt like the ultimate irony. But even then, he found ways to be heard. He wasn't a sentimental father. He didn't write long birthday cards or post nostalgic memories online. Instead, he captured moments with precision, framing a photo just right, editing a clip to feel timeless, storing a letter for the day it would matter most. His love wasn't loud. It was deliberate. And it came through in every note he left behind. But those handwritten letters, framed photos, and self-recorded messages weren't just keepsakes. They were his final project, a silent film only his children could ever fully understand. Most people leave behind bank accounts, property deeds, maybe a few family albums. Val Kilmer left behind a library. A collection of moments so meticulously prepared, it felt more like a final film than a farewell. This wasn't just estate planning. It was direction, curation, authorship. For nearly 10 years, while the world assumed he had disappeared, Kilmer had been quietly documenting the parts of himself he didn't want lost. Not for public view, not for legacy headlines, for Mercedes, for Jack, for the people who knew the man, not the myth. Dozens of videos were discovered, each one labeled with surgical precision. Titles, dates, folders sorted by year. He didn't just hit record and ramble. He set up shots, re-recorded lines, edited with clarity. Some clips were conversational. "Hi Jack, this one's from October 2017. You just turned 22. Others were full of stories, never told publicly. There were monologues, emotional reflections, and even passages from his favorite books read aloud in his strained, robotic voice. It wasn't performance. It was preservation. One assistant recalled that Kilmer would sometimes re-record the same segment 20 times, not because he was chasing perfection, but because he wanted to get the feeling right. He wasn't trying to be poetic. He was trying to be understood. Even as his voice deteriorated into fragments and whispers, he never stopped talking to his kids. Through film, through letters, through memory. Every click of the record button was a defiant act. I'm still here. I still have something to say. And he wasn't only speaking to them. Parts of his will revealed that Kilmer had been quietly funding causes close to his heart. He had created a fund for throat cancer research, donated to an arts education program for underserved kids in New Mexico, and anonymously supported a local theater class for over a decade. None of this had ever been public. His name was never listed as a sponsor. No press releases, just quiet giving. Then there was the land, the 160-acre ranch in New Mexico, where he spent his final years. In his will, he didn't demand that it be kept. He offered it like a gift, with one line that said everything. Keep this place if you need peace, or want to write a story of your own, without telling anyone. It wasn't just real estate. It was refuge, a sanctuary he had built with his own hands, now passed on to the only two people he trusted to understand its meaning. Even his former attorney, a man who had handled hundreds of high-profile estates, called Kilmer's farewell the most emotionally structured goodbye I've ever seen. There were no loose ends, no public spectacle, no big interviews scheduled for after death. It was private, personal, and intentional. A closing act, written and directed by the man himself. And yet, despite all the planning, it was a single forgotten detail that hit hardest. A small, handwritten note left in the drawer of his writing desk. It wasn't included in the will. It wasn't dated. It wasn't even addressed to anyone. But it said everything. Just 12 words. If I have to leave, at least let me leave something behind. Mercedes found it by accident. She didn't frame it. She didn't take a picture. She left it right where it was. Because that note wasn't just for her. It was for anyone who ever watched him, misunderstood him, or forgot him. It was proof that even in silence, Val Kilmer never stopped speaking. There's something different about handwriting. It's raw, unfiltered. The pauses, the slants, the pressure of the pen. Each mark tells a story that typed words never could. Val Kilmer understood this. That's why he didn't just leave digital files, organized folders, or printed documents. He left ink, lines scratched onto paper, thoughts scribbled in quiet moments when the cameras were off, and there was no one to perform for. And one of those notes, a small, almost accidental discovery, cut deeper than anything he ever said on screen. It wasn't stored with his will. It wasn't filed with his attorney or sealed in an envelope. It was sitting in the drawer of his old writing desk, folded once, no title, no recipient. Just 12 simple words. If I have to leave, at least let me leave something behind. No dramatic signature, no date, just that line, like a whisper preserved in paper. When Mercedes found it, she didn't post about it. She didn't move it. She didn't even show it to the press when questions started rolling in after the will became public. She left it there, untouched. Because it wasn't meant to be broadcast. It was Kilmer, at his most honest, his most unguarded. Not the actor, not the father, not the artist, just the man. Hoping, quietly, that something he'd created, some part of him, might continue to speak even when he no longer could. By the time the media caught up to the news of Kilmer's passing, much of the world had already moved on. There was no red carpet tribute, no Oscars in memoriam segment that tried to squeeze his life into a 30-second clip, and Kilmer would have been fine with that. He had already said goodbye, not publicly, but privately. Through a collection of gifts no studio could package, personal letters, unreleased scripts, videos recorded in soft light, and that single handwritten line that said more than any speech ever could. That note in the drawer became a quiet monument in the Kilmer home. Not because it was fancy, not because it was profound, because it was real. And in a career built on illusion, that kind of truth was rare. Val Kilmer never wanted to be frozen in time as Iceman, or remembered only as the actor who used to be great. He wanted to be remembered as someone who left something of himself behind, not for the masses, but for the ones who mattered. That's why, to this day, Mercedes refuses to move the note. Jack won't let anyone scan it or recreate it digitally. It stays where he left it, in the very place he sat down to write his final scripts, edit old videos, and speak into the silence. It's not part of a museum. It's not an exhibit. It's just a folded piece of paper in a drawer holding the weight of a lifetime in one line. But when you pull back and look at the whole picture, from his rise to stardom to his quiet exit, it becomes clear. Val Kilmer wasn't trying to be remembered by the world. He was trying to live truthfully in a world that constantly demanded a performance. Val Kilmer didn't want applause at the end. He didn't need a spotlight. He didn't crave a public farewell with montages and headlines. Instead, he did something so rare in a world driven by image. He left on his own terms, quietly, precisely, authentically. Not as a movie star, but as a man who understood the weight of legacy and the value of silence. Looking back now, the pieces form a picture that was always there, just hidden behind the glare of fame. His refusal to play Hollywood's games, his obsession with meaning over popularity, his move to the New Mexico desert, where he built a life that had nothing to do with scripts or studios, his choice to protect his children's privacy, his silence about his illness, and finally, his careful crafting of a goodbye so personal it could never be performed for a crowd. This wasn't a collapse. It wasn't a disappearance. It was a design. A farewell composed like a final act, one only his children and a few who truly understood him could fully appreciate. For a man who spent decades navigating a career where so many words were written for him, Val Kilmer spent his final years writing something no one else could, his truth. Even when his body betrayed him, when his voice was gone, when the fame faded and the roles stopped coming, he still had something to say. And he said it in letters, in footage, in handwritten notes that will never be posted online. He gave his children not just memories, but understanding. He gave his fans one final performance, not for box office numbers, but for the soul. And in doing so, he proved that legacy isn't just about what people remember. It's about what they feel when they remember you. Kilmer didn't fear death. He feared living without authenticity. He once wrote, "I'm not afraid of dying. I'm afraid of not living true to myself." And through every defiant career choice, every quiet moment in the desert, every unfinished story he handed off to Jack and Mercedes, he lived exactly that way. There will always be people who remember him as Batman, or Iceman, or Jim Morrison. But to those who look closer, Kilmer will always be something more. A man who didn't just act on screen, but directed his own final act with a clarity and grace that most never find. His story didn't end with a spotlight. It ended with a handwritten note in a drawer, a ranch in the desert, a video only 2 people will ever see, and a legacy too intimate to be reduced to fame. What are your thoughts on Val Kilmer's journey? Did his quiet farewell change how you see him? Drop a comment below and let us know. And if you found something meaningful in his story, consider subscribing, because we'll keep telling the untold truths of legends who lived beyond the screen.